I would love to ask you, what are your opening problems? Let's take it from there. Ken, please. Please.
When white plays e4, I play e5, and they go with either the Scotch or the Gambit, the Scotch Gambit, you know.
Right.
It kills me. I always get my king wrapped up with that queen coming and everything coming.
Well, the best move order, because, okay, let's go backwards and forwards. Okay, so e4 is by far the most common classical opening moves, e4. And e5 has long had the reputation of being the move that black uses to fight for equality right out of the opening. So e4, e5. Now, what had happened to me is that when my opponents played knight f3, I played knight f6, and I went into what we call the Petrov defense, what the rest of the world really refers to as the Russian defense, and I was a happy camper. So one day I came up against this very tricky grandmaster from Yugoslavia, Ljubomir Ljubojevic. And Lubo played d4. So I always, and I admired him greatly for this. This actually happened at the board. I had no real choice. I took the pawn, and now he played knight f3. So in this exact position, I have a wealth of moves, a large number of moves, and I sat for the better part of 30 minutes going through all the moves that I could potentially play in this position. So the first move, for example, was c5. I'm a pawn up. Got it. Pawn up. But after c3, d takes c3, knight takes c3, I hated my position. I just considered that this is an excellent, excellent pawn sacrifice for white. White's play is so easy. He simply brings his bishop to c4, he castles. If I ever put my pawn on d6, he'll bring his bishop to f4, he'll nail it, and black is just simply much, much, much worse. My second thought was bishop b4 check. And when I was a kid, I absolutely, absolutely loved the Danish gambit. And I played things like the Evans gambit with b4 on move 3, and so forth and so on. And after bishop b4 check, c3, d takes c3, b takes c3, regardless of where I move my bishop, bishop a5, bishop c5, bishop e7, comes bishop c4, and I'm worse. I hated my position. I really did. So after knight f3, here I thought, well, if I go knight f6, I'm now in a line of the Russian defense that I'm trying to avoid. So he would play e5, knight here, queen takes. All of these moves have been played countless hundreds of games, and it's well known that after queen f4 check, this is a position that favors white. White's play again is very simple. White's plan is to play bishop e3, castles long, and White's plan is to play knight d5. So in other words, this was a very tricky move order that got me out of my Russian defense. Let's go back for a second. I play the move knight, most people play the move knight f3. I play the move knight f6. Now, if they play the move d4, I don't take the pawn, which would get me into the position that I had with Lubo. I would take the pawn on e4, and this is the position that I wanted to play with the Russian defense. So in other words, if White's intention is to play the Scotch, he should do it with the move d4. So after d4 takes knight f3, after a long think, I said a half an hour, I played knight c6. In other words, I thought that after going through all the possibilities. Oh, pardon me, there was one other possibility. After knight f3, the other possibility was d5 to avoid the Scotch. But this kind of looks a little bit like the Scandinavian. After takes, knight here. I didn't like this position because unlike in the Scandinavian where, for example, I could go queen a5, well, after knight takes d4, it's very clear that my queen is not a happy camper. So d4 takes knight f3. If somebody's intent on playing the Scotch against you, you play knight c6. Okay. Now here, your opponents of white could consider moves bishop c4. They can consider move c3. But if they're going to play the Scotch, they're going to play knight takes d4. Now you're in it. Now you're in it. Knight takes d4. So here, after pretty much some thought, I played knight f6 and we went into a mainline Scotch, and okay, I won with black, but the Scotch today requires a great deal of knowledge. Okay. One of the old and favorite moves of Steinitz was queen h4. Okay. I don't like this move. I think that this move is too dangerous for black. The idea was that after knight b5, queen takes e4 check, bishop e2. In view of the threat of knight takes c7, you play king d8. You defend the c7 square. After the move castles, I think black is supposed to play a6, knight c3, queen e8, knight d5. It's a very funny thing. At the end of the day, you know, like if you were walking by the playing hall or something, walking by the board, you would say, you know, the idiots are playing a Scholastics tournament, and they set up the king and the queen on the wrong squares, and, you know, guys, I'm going to have to stop the clock and reset the pieces because this is not the way it's supposed to go. But Steinitz would like to defend this position a pawn down, and I don't like it. So we go back to this position. Black actually has three major moves outside of queen h4. The most popular is knight f6, going into the standard Scotch. The second most popular is bishop c5. So the most popular line of the Scotch goes knight f6, knight takes c6, takes e5, queen e7, queen e2, knight d5, c4, bishop a6. Hundreds of games, thousands of games, huge number of variations here for white. White could play b3 with the idea of bishop a3. White can play g3, as Garry Kasparov played on a number of occasions against Anatoly Karpov in their 1990 World Championship match. Crazy move h4. What's the idea of h4? The idea of h4 is after the move castles, you go rook here. What's the idea of rook h3? Well, the bishop on a6 attacks the queen on e2, x-rays, I should say, the queen on e2, so you can't take this knight. So the idea of rook h3 is to go rook a3, attack the bishop. If the bishop gets defended by the king, well, then you simply take the bishop and take the knight. Meanwhile, other ideas include bishop g5 and so on. There are a ton of lines. Nigel Short, in his 1993 World Championship match with Garry Kasparov, preferred bishop c5. And after bishop c5, knight takes, queen f6, threatening mate on f2, provoke the move queen d2, takes on c6, knight c3, and again, massive amount of complications, very unbalanced position, very, very hard to play because it just takes so much knowledge and so much time to understand and learn the lines. So I had a long discussion with a dear friend, now departed, Tony Miles. And he was saying, you know, like, he loved the Dragon Sicilian, but the guys were now lining up to crush his Dragon Sicilian by preparing to move 100. So he was going to make the switch to a classical defense e4, e5, and he wanted to pull the game into a particular line of the Ruy Lopez as black. And he really didn't mind the King's Gambit. He was ready to handle the King's Gambit. His problem was the Scotch. So I said to him, Tony, when you look at the Scotch as white, it's almost kind of a gambit style play. Obviously, white has not made a gambit, but it's very simple what white wants to do. White wants to develop his knight to c3, he wants to play his bishop to c4, he wants to castles, and it's all about fast development. Okay. Clear. I said, you can screw up white's development. He said, well, how do I do that? I said, well, what's the most natural square for the knight on b1? He says, of course, c3. I said, okay. What you do is you go bishop b4 check. And he goes, okay, well, what does that do? I said, well, if the guy plays knight c3, now, after the move knight f6, white is screwed up. He can't play this knight takes c3, b takes c6, e5, queen e7 line, queen e2 line, because the first and foremost is when the queen is on e2, it's blocking the bishop on f8, which provokes black into this whole line where he castles long. Now, after knight d5, there's no c4. This is simply a good position for black. After bishop d2, you castle short. White's king is in the center. Black is doing great. The move knight c3 sucks. Clearly, he says. So you have to play c3. Only move for an advantage. New main move. Okay. I say, now you messed white up. Now he stuck his pawn on c3, which is the ideal square for his knight. Now you play bishop c5. Now you play bishop c5. According to the books, the best move for white is bishop e3. You play bishop b6. Now, it doesn't really matter what white plays. His next few moves can be interchangeable. He could play bishop c4 or knight d2, and it doesn't matter. After, for example, bishop, let's say knight d2, you go knight e7, the guy goes bishop c4, you go castles, he goes castles. With his knight on d2, instead of its best square, c3, what does white give up? He gives up control over the d5 square. d5 takes, knight takes. Black equalizes very easily. Okay? But if you don't know this bishop b4 check idea, you can run into a lot of problems, especially against a player who's really very well prepared. In the Scotch game, strangely enough, it was Garry Kasparov who really took this century-old, the oldest line of play and really revitalized it with a lot of new ideas, essentially won and kept his world championship title thanks to the Scotch defense. It was only that after Tony Miles actually started playing bishop b4 check in numerous games that the Scotch suddenly wasn't winning all of the games that and you weren't getting those imbalanced positions that the white player is trying to meet. So Ken, considering that we imagine that you're black in this moment, and you know, you obviously play against the opponents you play with. What would you imagine that one of your opponents might play in this position if as white? Would they just develop their bishop to e3 because that looks like a good move?
I think it's usually bishop to c4.
Yeah, bishop c4. One of the. They actually think that bishop e3 is a little bit more accurate just to induce this loss of the tempo, but it doesn't matter. We'll play bishop c4 as you like. New variation here. Now here, this is a kind of an interesting moment for black, because now with the bishop already on c5, I start to have a quick think for just a quick a second, because I'm starting to like something that's actually funny. A moment ago, I shooed away the idea and said that queen h4 wasn't that good. Now, however, with the bishop on c4 and the bishop on c5, the idea of queen h4 starts to be a little bit more attractive. But now I have to think, okay, not 100% sure in this case, after bishop c4 right away. Let me just think about this a bit. I got some ideas that, I'm thinking several ideas. I'm thinking that you could play queen f6 to put pressure on d4. You could play knight f6, hitting this pawn on e4. What other attractive possibilities are there for black? I'm not sure. Okay, let's just pick one. Okay, I'm going to pick knight f6. So I'll attack this pawn on e4. I'll induce castling. Oops, yeah, there we go. Castles. So we get a position like this. So again, from black's point of view, what black would like to do is either take the pawn for free, thank you very much, or play for d7, d5. It's possible that white could make a pawn sacrifice with bishop g5, h6, bishop h4, g5, bishop g3, knight takes e4. But that's something that white should really, you know, prepare for. Like you need some, with a computer or chess engine, just to double check. But my recommendation for you is to look at the move bishop b4 check, provoke c3, then go bishop c5. You could save yourself a world of trouble. My pleasure. Questions about your openings? Now is the time, folks. Come on. Frank, you haven't played in ages. What was your big... Frank Camaratta from the House of Staunton is here today, from Tennessee. You've played correspondence world chess. You've played master level over the board chess. What did you have a problem with when you were black?
When I was black?
Yeah. What would bug you?
As white.
Okay.
I always played the Whittaker as black.
Okay.
I never liked to face it as white.
Okay. So you were a French defense player, amongst other things, and you found the move bishop b4 off-putting. Like you didn't really like the positions that came.
The type of game I like, which is avoid the open position.
Right, and that is true. That is true. This particular position from white's point of view, it's really, really hard to open the position. And in truth, the leverage for opening the position more often stands with black. That is to say, black gets the chance to play f7, f6. This idea of f4, f5 never really works for white. So essentially, it's black's choice to keep this position closed.
Because the two levers,
Yeah.
they're sitting there, they're tension the entire,
Yeah.
very difficult play.
Mm-hmm.
The poison pawn never appealed to me. I think white got a lot out of it.
Which was interesting. Yeah, in this particular position, I always felt that the strongest move for black was knight e7. Other people have different ideas, but I always thought that knight e7. Now, in this particular position as white, I thought that white had three moves only, even though white's played a lot of other moves. one move is, what are you going to do with your bishop? Your bishop on c1. So one move that I always paid particular attention to was a4, with the intention of bringing the bishop out to a3. The other move that I paid particular attention to was h4, with the idea of advancing this pawn as quickly up the board as I could. In other words, I didn't want black to ever really get full control of this square, and once I have my pawn on h5, I'm not worried about knight f5 because I always have g4. So I always thought there were three primary moves here: h4, h4, a4. Knight f3 is like the standard move, and I never really liked that for white. The other move I thought that was the most challenging was queen g4. What you said is the poison pawn. I never quite thought of the winner were poison pawn. I'm not exactly sure what this is called, but okay, queen g4, knight c6, queen takes. From the days of Botvinnik, Smyslov, and many decades before and after, this has been a crucial position. I always thought that this position was actually favorable for white. And the reason was I thought that this move, knight f3, was best. I think that they played knight e2. Queen c7, f4 takes, queen here, and this position has been played countless times. So this is like the standard position. I think for the better part of decades, everybody and his brother was playing bishop d7. I like queen takes c3. They played castles. I like bishop d2. And I liked white. Okay, I liked white. And I remember getting into a hoary public battle in the pages of Inside Chess with none other than John Watson, International Master John Watson, who was a very big supporter of the French defense. He said, how dare you transgress and suggest for a moment that black's position is worse and blah, 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 blah. Now, today, what is very extraordinary is everybody agrees with me that queen takes c3 leads to an advantage for white. The move that everybody seems to be playing, including Gaudikamsky and others, is this move. And like at the time that I was studying this particular line at the Winterwear, d4, nobody played d4. Like, well, what's that? Well, the idea is, as gross as it is that after you trade, I think they go here, here, here. Black's idea is basically as simple as he wants to castle, sometimes simply at the cost of this pawn on a7. He wants to play bishop g2, and his pieces stand really, really powerfully, okay? And a lot of grandmasters are having trouble with d4 in this line at the Winterwear. And I don't know what the up-to-date latest and greatest is. I just know that when I was studying this line for white and black, I like white's position after bishop d7, queen takes c3, and I don't know what to make of d4 today. So I'd have to give that a rethink.
That is a logical move.
It is, and nobody played it the time I was studying it. I mean, it was logical only in the sense that it defends the pawn on c3, but
That's why my founder played it as black. And didn't know how to respond to it as white. And kind of spoiled his defense for him.
Well, here again, there are many approaches that white could take. Okay, so for example, taking this pawn sure looks attractive. I have seen guys go nuts here with the very barbaric h4. So that very barbaric idea is just as it looks. The idea is to run this pawn as fast as possible to h7. Okay, so why would we want, let's just throw a move in here for white, for black. I'm not saying this is the best move or anything like that. I'm just, so I can give you an idea, an illustration rather, of what's in white's intent is by putting the pawn on h7 as fast as possible, You draw the rook to h8, so you get to play g4. Once the pawn gets to g4, there's no funny business with the knight coming f5, knight e3. And once the pawn gets to g4, you've got this very nice diagonal that you can sit upon. It doesn't necessarily like guarantee white an advantage or something like that. I'm just saying that there are other possibilities for white than capturing the pawn on d4. To my mind, I don't like that pawn on d4. I wanted to capture it, you know, and like take as many of black's units off the board as I could. So, I mean, I'd have to just check what the games are, what the current valuation is. But the winner still remains a problem for white. You're right. You're right.
Have you ever given much discussion in class on the exchange sacrifice, the dragon, those things?
Oh yes. Oh yes. Oh yes. Oh yes. We have looked at numerous rook takes c3 sacrifices. I was showing the pin variation not too long ago, where I was saying, well, in the pin variation, the Sicilian, you're not giving up an exchange, you're just doubling white's pawns, and it's sort of like saying, hey, you know, prove the pawns aren't weak. All right, let me see here. Next question, please.
Yarrow-back used to give me a lot of trouble for
yes.
playing black. It was hard to play, get an advantage against what
yeah. Yeah, well, indeed, I love playing the Averbach variation against the King's Indian. Essentially today, the King's Indian has been kind of like this resilient creature that everybody's been trying to kill and been, you know, throwing all kinds of new ideas against the King's Indian. By the way, I should say that this is not a tabia position, knight f3. But I noticed that a lot of players from Levon, Aronian, and others are experimenting with a very early h3. So it's not like the same-ish. They want to play h3, bishop e3, and sometimes put their knight on f3. White is doing all kinds of things, and black is doing all kinds of things. One of my favorites was bishop e2, castles, and now we have the basic tabia position for what is called the Averbach system. Yuri Averbach, Grandmaster from the Soviet Union, now Russia. One of the most long-lived Grandmasters, I think Yuri is one of the oldest. He's up there in his 90s. He championed this system. It bears his name. A very popular system with me when in the youth of my career. I liked this very much because it just seemed to me that it took a lot of the sting, if you will, out of the King's Indian. In a proper King's Indian, after the move e5, d5, black is forever aspiring to play f5. And it just seemed to me that the move bishop g5 interfered, threw a spanner in those ideas. And if black ever played h6, I was really happy, because after I would retreat with my bishop to e3, I'd end up picking up a tempo with queen d2, provoking the move king h7. And as every King's Indian defense player knows, that when you're playing for e5 and f5, your king doesn't belong on h7. So I was doing horrible things to the world of chess with my trusty Averbach. And I ran into a guy, his name was Boris Gelfand. And Boris, in those days, took a very, very innovative approach to this position that nobody had ever played against me. I had a ton of games that went c5, d5, and it ended up looking like a Benoni type of position, and I enjoyed playing those positions for white. I had a ton of opponents play e5, d5 against me, getting into those King's Indian, where this pin somehow really throws black off of his game, and I just had a tremendous success record. So what Gelfand did, he took a very novel approach against me. He played c7, c6. Looks like a simple non-committal move.
Before you go down that,
Yeah.
on the E4, on the E5 line,
Yes, E5, D5, yeah.
What happens when pawn takes, queen takes, rook takes, knight d5?
Pawn takes, queen takes, rook takes, knight d5. Have I did it in the wrong way? Am I supposed to play h7, h6 first or something? I sure hope I haven't done it in the wrong way, because here I may simply be losing material. So I must be thinking of h6 first. Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm sure I'm thinking of h6, my game with Balashov, where Balashov played h6, bishop e3, e5, d5 first. I apologize. What I did happen, pardon me, nope. C6, where is it there? C6. I played queen d2. Okay, so please, I'm thinking to myself, please play e5 and I can get into the I want to play e5, d5 and get into the kinds of King's Indian defense positions where my bishop on g5 is simply more than annoying. Gelfand played knight a6 against me, and this was a real conundrum. It sort of like says to white, okay, what are you going to play? If you play knight f3, then you can get into lines of play that are simply transpositional, that are not unique to the Averbach. And in the Averbach system, oftentimes white wants, in some cases, to be able to play g4. Right? In those cases where e5, d5 gets shut down, you want to play g4. In other cases, you want to play f4. So I thought this was an opportunity to play f4, knight here, knight here, knight here. How weird is that? How many King's Indians have you ever seen where black's knight gets onto the e6 square? None, zero. So this was quite a unique approach by Boris Gelfand, and I really admired him for it. I think I played bishop g5 to h4, and he played bishop here. Like, now I was completely, bamboozled. There were reasons that I didn't want to play g3. What were those reasons? Now I have to remember. I don't think I wanted to play g3 because of d5. And suddenly this knight on e6 attacks my pawn on d4 and makes it impossible for me to play knight takes e4. So this was a very, very, very different type of approach by black to the Averbach system. It gave me fits. Long story short, I ended up losing the game with white, and this idea of c6, knight a6, knight c7, knight e6 made a very powerful impression to me. And when I analyzed it at home, I ended up giving up the Averbach. For this reason, as well as my game with Garry Kasparov, too, where Gary did bad things to my Averbach opening. And I just thought that this move, knight a6, maneuver, knight a6, knight c7, knight e6, really deserves consideration. So that's where I would recommend you go for salvation if the Averbach was giving you problems. So c6, knight a6, what did I play again? I played f6 because I was just thinking that in case I play knight f3, now e5 gets me to a position where I'm not happy with the fact that I don't have these ideas of f3 and g4, and black's doing quite okay, maybe even very well. in this.
Can you take the knight at that point?
With b4? No, I think e4 is hanging.
Except that it's hanging.
Well, there is an issue.
Yeah,
I think it's hanging here. Well, I'm threatening knight takes f3, bishop e7. Let's say here. Bishop takes d6. Let's say, I'm not, well, yeah, why not? Just take this guy. Knight takes f3 check. You probably have to take with the pawn. If we take with the bishop, we got to be careful about, about being exposed. So takes, I'm assuming takes. This looks pretty reasonable for black. You still have e4 too. You got, you got this double threat. So black is threatening to take and take advantage of the pin, as well as this very annoying bishop. True, yeah, and he may, yeah, I think it's more like the other. But in any case, regardless of whether white is managing to save his position or not, suddenly, somehow the initiative shifted, right? That this is a position that I wouldn't necessarily embrace as white. Probably something like bishop f5, intending rook c8, is a little bit unpleasant for the first player to play. In any case, one thing's for sure, King's Indian defense players can rejoice. They got that beautiful bishop on g7.
First the white bishop, white king bishop has some pretty good play too.
Pardon me, this guy on e2?
Yes, some play. But he has to survive.
Yeah.
Detail.
Yeah, small little details. Anyway, that was the thing that put me off of the other bag. Just something to put in your cap and stew over. Put it in your chess engine. Have fun when you have a lazy afternoon. c6, knight a6, knight c7, knight e6.
The whole concept of kind of blocking in the king bishop obviously is a lot of.
Oh, absolutely. The King's Gambit, again, arguably the oldest opening, or
It seemed to go on a big paper here. Like, I know back in the late 80s, I was seeing it all the time.
yeah. Well, one of the fellows who was really trying his best to champion the cause of the King's Gambit was Nigel Short. Nigel Short was playing it off and on. There's always periods of excitement. Somebody comes up with some new idea, and it suddenly has a burst of popularity, and then it kind of dies off in fashion. Well, a number of the sharpest lines of the King's Gambit have been analyzed to draws. Okay, so that's already one thing that white finds very off-putting, is that if black knows what he's doing and he plays it in the sharpest possible way, the game is probably a draw. But to me, and a defense I've always championed when I'm black, I like playing against the King's Gambit, is to accept the gambit. Now basically there are moves. There are moves like bishop c4 here. There are moves like d4 here. But by far the most often played move is knight f3, because black is facing this potentially disruptive check. Black is threatening to make this potentially disruptive check. And I remember, you know, like, I think it was Jeffrey Parsons had loaned me one of his books. And Steinitz, of all people, played the move b3 here with white. And you go, holy cow, well, what's the idea of b3? Well, the idea of b3, and I'm not going to challenge you guys to guess, because that will just put you, you'll give up chess, is to put the king on b2. Steinitz's idea is to put the king on b2. Yeah, so the idea was that after check, king here, d5, knight f3, bishop g4 takes this pawn. What Steinitz wants to do is go king here, king here, and king here. Okay. I don't recommend that you do this at home. Maybe if you're Steinitz. But the point is that white does and has entertained other moves. Bishop c4 is one move, d4 is another, but by far the most popular is knight f3. Okay. So this is our main line. Now here, lots of choices. Bobby Fischer wrote a book, A Bust to the King's Gambit, and played the move d7, d6. Many theory books have recommended h6. Other people like Mickey Adams is a big champion of d5 here. I don't play any of those. This is so easy to learn. It's banal. You play g5. You just play g5. Okay. Now, essentially in this position, if it's black to move, black plays bishop g7, d6, h6, plays like Bobby Fischer recommended in his guide to A Bust to the King's Gambit, and white is busted. In this position, it's been long established that the only move to even try to equalize for white is to play h4. Okay?
He's already starting to equalize after g5.
Any move other than the move h4, and he fails to equalize. Okay, so he has to play h4. But here's the question. Does he get an advantage after h4? Okay, black is obliged to play g4. White plays knight here. Now it's obvious and very easy if white is allowed to play moves like d4, bishop takes f4, knight takes g4, well, black can resign. Okay, so black plays d7, d6, attacking the knight. There's no choice. White has to take this pawn, and after knight takes g4, the best move is knight f6. Okay. So here, white is facing a very clear choice. Should he trade or play knight f2? Now, essentially, the theoreticians have said, well, after knight f6, black gets the better game. White has to play knight f2. Okay? I mean, just check the databases. Okay, so here, after knight f2, we pause, and we just go, okay, 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3, black to move. On the other hand, if white is able to play f4 and bishop takes d4 and bishop takes f4, white has perfect, resign, you just lose. So very, very key move here for black is rook g8. Very important move. This really messes white up because it ties the bishop to the f1 square, anchors the pawn on g2. And with the move rook g8, it also creates a very, very powerful incentive for white to move his king queenside. In other words, after rook g8, you really don't want to castle short. You're not happy about that decision. So rook g8, d4. These moves have been played many times. Bishop d4, bishop d4, bishop h6, knight c3, knight c6. Right. Okay, knight c6. Now we start to get to a critical position. White to move. White to move. Okay, as we look at the position, we start to understand that this pawn on d4 is really requiring the services of the queen. Okay? You start thinking to yourself, as white, I want to exit stage left. So I've got to make a move like queen to d3, bishop to d2, castles. And if I can execute all of those moves, well, black has issues. One move that you really, really, really want to avoid is d5. After d5, knight e5, the knight's terrific. It's just this fantastic blockader in the center of the board, and white is going to have a massive number of problems. So everybody played queen d3. Now back in the early 80s when I was looking at the stuff, oops, this was the main line. And here there was a line of play that I really wanted to do for black. Check this out. I wanted to play rook g3. Nobody ever allowed me to do this. Nobody ever allowed me to do this. Rook g3. Okay. So white clearly has to defend his pawn on d4. He's got to play queen c4. Now I really wanted to play bishop e6. You bring out the pieces, you know, go, 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 right? So what could white do? I mean, he's almost obliged to play d5. I mean, because, you know, it's tough otherwise. Okay, so d5, knight e5. I thought queen b5 check. I thought bishop here. I thought queen takes. Now here, I've sacrificed a pawn, but I was absolutely convinced that black stood better. Now this is kind of like home analysis and stuff like that. Again, I never got a chance to use it in practice in a real game. But my attitude was, you know, a lot of white pieces are passive. I really like this harmonious development of my knight. Okay, I've sacrificed a pawn. It's funny, my king may not look good. It's certainly not castling short, it's not castling long, but I thought that king f8 really put the onus on white. Like, white does not want to make the move bishop d2, because after rook b8, he's giving up this pawn on b2, and white's king still hasn't found sanctuary. If white makes a move, for example, like queen a6, well, I've got ideas like this knight coming to g4, after a trades, knight's coming to e3. I've also got ideas, again, after queen a6, ideas like queen e8, putting pressure. I think I actually saw some line. It went, okay, hold on. No, this was a stupid idea. I apologize. This came from a stupid move like knight here. Greedy. Just stupid, stupid greed. So the idea of the stupid greed was that when the knight jumps to b5, and that was the reason for my king e8, I was getting out of this one with check. This knight on b5 gave up protection of the e4 square, and I was attracted to this line. Check, which is why I put my rook on g3 in the first place, because after bishop takes, pawn takes, my idea with black is as soon as this knight moved from f2, I wanted to play knight takes e4 and have some fun. You know, let's rock and roll. And so this is my recommended line to you, Ken, that in case your opponents come up with the king's gambit in this or another game, you take it. Knight f3, you go g5. You go for g4. You force the knight to move to e5. You play d6. You force the knight to capture. Knight f6, and this star move rook g8.
I would never think of rook to g8.
I know. And this other kind of funny looking move, bishop h6, but it's necessary, it's vitally important for you to maintain the pawn on f4. After knight c3, knight c6, this move rook g3. That's already, by the way, a lot of the people who play the king's gambit, their attitude is, look, I'm playing this gambit to take the initiative. and I want to blast you off the board, and you're coming out with moves like rook g3 and bishop e6,